Hey, writers, and welcome back to I Will Go Down with This Ship, where we break down the art of storytelling. Today, we're talking about one of the most essential storytelling frameworks, the three-act story structure. It's a timeless tool for crafting compelling stories with strong arcs, whether you're writing a novel, screenplay, or short story. In this video, I'll walk you through each act, what makes it work, and give you some practical tips for using this structure to elevate your own writing. And as a bonus, I've got a free three-act story structure printable for you with a chapter by chapter breakdown of plot points and a template to fill in with your own story. You can grab it by clicking the link below, and it works for any genre. So with that in mind, let's dive in. The three-act story structure divides your story into three parts: the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. It's a classic storytelling framework that helps you build momentum, develop your characters, and bring your plot to a satisfying conclusion. While the three-act structure is often used in screenwriting, it's just as valuable for novelists and short story writers. So let's break down each act, starting with Act 1. Act one, the setup, is all about introducing your characters, establishing the setting, and kicking off your story with the inciting incident. This act sets the foundation for everything that follows, so you want to make sure you're hooking your readers right from the beginning. Think of the inciting incident as the spark that ignites the plot. It's the moment that pushes your protagonist into the main conflict. For example, in The Hunger Games, it's when Katniss volunteers in place of her sister. This sets up the entire story in motion. You make Act One work. Focus on two, oh, sorry. To make Act One work, focus on two key things: character goals and the stakes. By the end of Act One, your audience should know what your protagonist wants, why they want it, and what's at risk if they don't get it. And remember, the inciting incident should happen relatively early. Don't wait too long to introduce it. So, a couple of tips for Act One: start with a clear hook, introduce your main character's goal, and make sure the inciting incident happens within the first 10 to 15% of the story. If you have a 30 chapter book, which is what the outline that you can grab below looks like, your inciting incident should be around chapter 3 or chapter 4. And don't forget, my three-act story structure printable includes a breakdown of what to include in each chapter, so be sure to check that out. Let's say you're writing a cozy mystery. So what I like to do is my body drop or a mystery, right? That's going to happen around chapters 3, chapter 4. And when the sleuth decides that they're going to get involved, that's going to happen at the trigger point in chapter 6, which would end our Act 1. Does that make sense? If we're looking at an arranged marriage romance, or even a marriage of convenience, that marriage offer is going to happen early on. That's our inciting incident. That's going to be around chapter 3, chapter 4. But the acceptance of that offer is chapter 6 at the end of that act, because that's going to get us into our second act, the confrontation. So the confrontation is the longest part of the story and where most of the action takes place. It's all about conflict, challenges, and character development. Your protagonist is now fully immersed in the plot, and the stakes are getting higher. Act two is often divided into two halves: the first half, where your protagonist faces new challenges, and the midpoint, where something big happens to change the game. This turning point shifts the story's direction, making the stakes even more intense. In Star Wars: A New Hope, Luke's training with Obi-Wan is part of Act Two's first half. He's learning and he's growing. But the midpoint comes when the Death Star destroys Alderaan, showing Luke just how high the stakes really are. Usually, the midpoint is going to force your character into more of a proactive role. Even in the first half of Act Two, where your sleuth has decided to solve this case, she's not necessarily taking that active role. Maybe she happens to see a couple of clues. Maybe she goes out of her way to talk to a couple of suspects, asks a few questions. But that midpoint, whether that's that second body drop or a new revelation that completely shifts her perception of how the case is going to be, completely changes how she handles the case moving forward. And it forces her to now choose to be more proactive. So instead of letting things happen to her, she's making a choice to start acting, if that makes sense. To make Act Two engaging, continuously challenge your protagonist. They should be facing obstacles that get progressively harder. Remember, we don't want to jump into the second act with something huge, only to drop and then sort of like give a couple of little obstacles. If she already faced Darth Vader at the beginning of Act Two, of course she's going to take out stormtroopers, no problem. We have to show that it escalates in a way that makes sense. Tip for this is use the midpoint to shift the story's direction, escalate the stakes, and challenge your protagonist's beliefs and abilities. They kind of come to the midpoint with that shit's hitting the fan, but it's not quite the black moment. It's basically your perception. The perception has completely shifted what they thought they knew. In romance, usually this means they realize they have feelings for each other, or at least one of them does. So this is going to bring us into our final act, which is the resolution. This is where everything comes together. The climax of the story happens here, followed by the resolution where all loose ends are tied up unless you're writing a series. The climax is the moment when your protagonist faces the central conflict head on. This is what the entire story has been building toward. It's usually an intense, action-packed, or emotional scene where everything is at stake. After the climax, readers need a resolution. This is where you show the aftermath, reveal how the protagonist has changed, and wrap up any subplots. And if you're not sure how to balance the climax and the resolution, that free printable has you covered with a chapter by chapter breakdown that works for any genre. So, a tip for this is make sure the climax is satisfying and pays off the tension you've built in Acts 1 and 2. Then, give readers a resolution that reflects the journey your characters have been through. Now that we've broken down each act, let's go over a few extra tips for mastering that 3-act story structure. First, make sure the stakes are clear throughout the entire story. What's at risk for your protagonist and how do those stakes escalate? Second, focus on pacing. Act 1 should hook your reader. Act 2 should build momentum. And remember, it's usually the longest act. And Act 3 should deliver a strong payoff. So the way that I've structured it in that 30 chapter template is chapters 1 through 6 are Act 1, chapters 7 through 24 are Act 2, and chapters 25 through 30 are Act 3. Finally, don't be afraid to subvert expectations. The 3-act structure is flexible. Use it as a guide, but find ways to surprise your readers along the way. Structure is important because it helps with your pacing. And if you have these ideas, sometimes you need just slots to fill these ideas in. And that's where this printable comes in. By using the 3-act story structure as a foundation, you'll have a strong framework to build your story around. And if you want a more detailed guide, like I said, don't forget, it's completely free. Just click on the link below and you'll get it. To recap, Act 1 sets up your story, introduces your characters, and includes the inciting incident. Act 2 is the confrontation where your protagonist faces challenges and the stakes rise. This is also where your black moment happens at the very end of Act 2. Act 3 is that resolution where everything comes to a head in the climax and then the story wraps up, giving your readers a satisfying conclusion based on how you've structured your world and your plot. Remember, a great story needs a solid structure to keep readers hooked, but how you fill that structure is where the magic happens. So that's it for today's video. If you found these tips helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe for more storytelling advice. And don't forget to download that free 3-act story structure printable. It's perfect for any genre and will help you take your story to the next level. Let me know in the comments what your favorite 3-act story structure is and why it works so well. Thanks for watching and happy writing.